everyone. Hello, hello, hello. And welcome to GraphQL Summit's panel on learning GraphQL. My name is Eve Porcello. It's a big honor to be here with you all and to be with all of these incredible panelists over here. I'm trying to point at them Brady Bunch style, but my, my window's too small. So I just want to say hi to, starting from the upper left-hand corner, to Prince Wilson. How's it going?
It's going great.
Awesome. And Kate is here. Hello, Kate. Efimova, welcome from California. West Coaster. Monica is here in the lower left-hand corner. How are you, Monica?
Well.
And Carolyn, how's it going?
It's good. How are you?
I'm great. I love that everyone is waving. I think we should be normalizing waving into the camera. We should have fun and wave as much as we want in these Zooms. So we shouldn't feel bad about that. So I'm really excited to be here today. All of these people are incredible software engineers, but they're also teachers. They're constantly sharing what they know, and I'm really excited to learn from them today. So the reason we are all here today is to kind of talk about the process of learning GraphQL, what's worked for these panelists who have done it, what hasn't worked. And if you're in the audience on the stream and you're a GraphQL super expert and you're thinking, I already learned GraphQL. This is in my past. Maybe some things that we discuss can help you onboard others to work with GraphQL successfully so that they love it and they want to use it for every project. So with all of that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it. So I want to take us way back. Let's think way back to when we learned GraphQL in the first place, when we began our journey with GraphQL. What was it like to learn GraphQL? What was like your first week learning GraphQL like, and what types of tools did you use? I'm going to start with, anybody want to jump in? I'll pick on you, sure. But I'll let you do it. Yeah, hit it, Kate.
So for me personally, I guess like the first week or two learning GraphQL has been familiarizing myself with the tools and like the very basics. I personally kind of started on the server side and decided to specialize specifically in like GraphQL plus Node and TypeScript. So for example, one of the things that I've been specifically figuring out how to do for a few hours, like I don't know, like 2 weeks ago, was how to break down a singular schema into a more modularized solution. So for example, every object type like user or card or product then would be able to have its own schema and its own resolver definitions. So then I also decided to use GraphQL Code Gen because it would allow to generate TypeScript types so that I wouldn't have to like redefine already what I have in my schemas. And then basically it turns out that Apollo server allows multiple type definitions for resolvers as well as the GraphQL GraphQL Code Gen allows to accept like multiple schemas. So that's kind of a fun thing that I did some time ago.
That's awesome. How about you, Prince? What was it like learning GraphQL?
Yeah. Coming from just building with Ruby on Rails and like RESTful architecture, I was like, why would I ever want to use GraphQL? But then I was like, wait, let me take a step back. Let me actually see it and look at how it works. And I actually was pretty impressed. I started with just reading about the GraphQL.com, the .org site, and going through and kind of getting like my literature around from there. And then also going and starting through the Apollo work that's there and just kind of playing around and building my own toy app. And I think that's like my learning process is just like starting to build with something and then seeing like, what do these fancy words mean? Because I don't really understand.
What are all of these GraphQL words? Totally. Monica, how about you? What was your journey like with learning GraphQL?
Yes. So I would say for my journey of learning GraphQL, originally I kind of learned it or started to learn it by accident. So I was using Gatsby.js, which is a React framework, for a side project, and all of the data management by default uses GraphQL. So as soon as I started, there were like already queries, like pulling in data, and I had to kind of understand like what was happening, at least at a minimum level to like edit the pages or to change what information is being pulled in. So that was like my first exposure using GraphQL more so like as a consumer, and also more so writing queries. And then as I got more familiar with like how the data was working or how the data was being pulled in, I was able to then like write mutation or resolvers. But it definitely, for me, it started off just like needing to understand like how to actually query the information. So that was kind of how I fell into starting to learn GraphQL.
Totally. Yeah, Gatsby throws you into the GraphQL snake pit really fast. And I think it's so cool that it's based on that, because I think more and more people will be using GraphQL because it is baked into Gatsby. So that's awesome. Hey, Carolyn, how about you? What about your start?
So I first learned GraphQL as part of a job interview process back when I was a technical writer. So I was asked to build an app with GraphQL, Apollo, and React. Kind of knew React, didn't know GraphQL or Apollo. And I had also had to write a tutorial on that app. So I have a lot of opinions about having that big of a chunk in your job interview process. But I was mostly just focused on throwing together. It was like an image board that showed pictures of baby hippos. So I was really focused on throwing it together, and I didn't really learn what I was doing. Like I had built an app, but I hadn't, like with GraphQL, but I couldn't have ever really explained how or why. So I didn't really get it until later. I had a job where I was given the time to really revisit and learn the fundamentals. So my first 2 weeks were a little hectic, I would say.
Yeah, totally. What types of learning resources when you were first learning did you reach for? I know, Prince, you said the docs. Were there any other like tutorials or things that you found useful?
I personally really enjoyed using howtographql.com. They have a series of tutorials on both the client and server side, and it was essentially originally developed by the Prisma team, but then kind of picked up by the overall open source community. And like I believe they have like Node and Elixir and Ruby and Java and Python and whatever languages you can think of. And I think that's kind of pretty cool. And I believe like because it's open source, I think it's going to probably stay up to date with the new GraphQL features and as GraphQL moves forward, as well as I hope that if somebody like stumbles upon something and doesn't understand something from the first time and like do their own research and figure it out, that they would be able to then kind of contribute for the overall good of like everybody else.
Yeah. Howtographql.com, howtographql.com, howtographql.com. If you haven't checked out that site before, it's really awesome. And you should definitely get in there if you're looking to learn anything about GraphQL. And as you said, like for any platform really, because the thing about the GraphQL that's kind of cool is that you don't have to be necessarily a JavaScript engineer or any certain type of engineer to really benefit from it. So what other learning resources? Anybody have a favorite that was useful as you were learning stuff?
Oh my gosh, I do. It's Eve's book.
Oh no.
I promise she didn't pay me. But really, this book was really helpful. Every time I'm on a team that needs to learn GraphQL for a new project, I usually order it for the library in the office. Or yeah, I think it's really good fundamentals, especially because it's detached from specific programming languages necessarily. So you really get down to those like root concepts and fundamentals. I also really like Apollo's GraphQL glossary to address exactly what Prince was talking about, this issue with all of these terminologies that's really hard to keep track of and hard to figure out what does SDL really mean? Took me forever to figure that out.
For sure.
So, yeah.
That's very funny that you had that prop available at your disposal.
I was prepared.
You're very prepared. Love it. Who else? What other learning resources have you enjoyed using?
Well, I was going to echo the how to learn GraphQL. I really like the interactivity within the documentation. And then also like really like explore. I feel like taking advantage of the fact that you can explore the GraphQL schema like within the different like GraphQL Playgrounds. I think was for me very helpful for me to like really actually understand like how to write queries and like making sure that I could see like in real time what data was being returned. It took me, I would say, longer than I want to admit to find out that there was like the graphical was embedded in Gatsby. So yeah, I definitely urge people to like really just like explore and get to know the schema, like not necessarily just like how it looks like in the code, but also when you're writing the queries and like what is the data that's being returned look like, and not being afraid to really dive into that.
Totally. Can you imagine not having graphical or the GraphQL Playgrounds to work with GraphQL? It would be a very different world, a sadder world, a less enjoyable world, I think, definitely. Are there any of those playgrounds, like public ones, that you use to play around with data? I know there's the Star Wars API, which is like the rule. You have to use that one at some point eventually, but are there others?
I've used like GitHub. They have two APIs. So they have a REST API and a GraphQL API. And for the GraphQL one, you can like authenticate as yourself and then write queries within the browser. So I thought that was cool for me because there were like some ideas I had, and I just quickly wanted to understand, like, does it seem like these methods are actually exposed in the API or not? And it got me to like be able to kind of like do a little bit of rough like prototyping without actually having to like set up the API locally. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the GitHub API, if you're learning GraphQL, is something really I'd encourage you to check out, just because you can play with all of your live data, which is wild. You can send pull requests through the GitHub Explorer if you really want to take too long to do that, things like that. But it's very fun. All right. So what was the most challenging part of learning GraphQL? I skipped over Prince on the last question, so I'll start with you here.
I think to the point I made before, it's just a lot of the language. I think what specifically like the terminology that is used, as well as like what are the kind of different options that you can use. Like at first, the course that I used was like Wes Boss's Advanced React and GraphQL course, which happened to go through Prisma at the time and Yoga. And I was like, wait, but why not Apollo server? And just like knowing that there's all these different options and like what those options mean and like what's the kind of like drawbacks to those. And that was kind of the part that I struggled the most with, is figuring out what's like the right approach, or is there like a kind of pathway that I should be taking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Carolyn,
I guess I can also go.
Sorry. Yeah, please.
Oh, I guess I just wanted to go off what Prince said, and the fact that it's hard to know where to start as well. So like Prince chose to start with Wes Boss's course, but there are like countless talks, countless articles, countless like video tutorials. It might be kind of difficult mentally to figure out where to start. And I think the best advice that I can give here is pick a specific tech stack and pick a specific like type of architecture that you perhaps are familiar with, and start like loose and then go from there, expand your knowledge from there.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. It's funny because, like I said before, there's not one way to do GraphQL. There's a lot of cool ways of getting started. So I think picking a stack is really important, or you start to like drown in the sea of options, you know? So Monica, are there any challenges that you ran into when you were learning GraphQL?
Yeah, I would definitely say like when writing, for example, when writing resolvers, like really understanding, I guess like what are the conventions, like what are the best practices as to like how you should handle mutations and things like that, since there is like a shift between like how the GraphQL way to do things and the RESTful way to do things. So I would, I guess, echo what others were saying as to like really understanding like the conventions and like what are some of the drawbacks to like different approaches as to how you handle data in GraphQL, since there is like a lot of flexibility, but not everything necessarily like scales or and things like that. So for me, that was like the most challenging part of just like really trying to learn like the GraphQL way of doing things versus necessarily like how to get it working.
Yeah, for sure. There's no one right way to do it. So that always makes things tough. Carolyn, do you have anything on that? Like what was challenging for you when you were getting started?
Yeah, so I'm primarily a front-end developer. So I think when I first got started, it was hard to figure out like where to go as someone who is pretty much only front-end. So I would get partway through a tutorial and then I'd be like, whoa, scary back-end stuff. Like, I'm just gonna put that over there. So I was really intimidated by a lot of the things I was running into. So I'll throw in another like learning resource that really helped me was Peggy Raises has a guide called A Front-End Developer's Guide to GraphQL. And it kind of walks through how you use GraphQL on the front end and different examples of, client libraries and things like that. So I found it really helpful. Maybe it will help someone else.
Yeah, totally. That's a great one. Someone was mentioning in the chat too, there's the SpaceX API. That's a good one to get started with. That's kind of from an earlier question, but that's a fun one to, if you're looking for some data to ask for, you can ask for it from there. So there is a huge ecosystem of all these GraphQL tools out there that exist. So what's next for you? What are you excited to learn about next? And I'll be a teacher and I'll stare. Yeah. Go for it.
So for me personally, I'm gonna be super guilty of it. Testing. I haven't exactly learned either unit or integration testing, whether on front end or on the back end, and how to do it with GraphQL, as well as how to secure GraphQL APIs, either with authentication or like protecting it from potential malicious attacks. Like guilty as charged.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, those are both great ones. What about you, Carolyn?
Yeah, I was actually also going to say testing, so that's great. I think it's really, it's something that I found really important through like my own developer journey, and this idea of like testing GraphQL APIs and how do we do it, especially things like how can we use like GraphQL's built-in type safety and introspection to help us write like accurate predictive tests. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and how it plays into the whole ecosystem of like test-driven development or property-based testing. Like, I don't know. I find it really fascinating just based on the way GraphQL is inherently structured.
Totally. Prince, what about you? What are you excited about in the world of GraphQL?
I don't know. I feel like there's just always constantly things that are happening that I haven't actually kept up with. I haven't kept up with Federation and like what that actually looks like. One of the last things I really looked at was specifically with like Apollo Engine, like just understanding more of like how do we get that information about what are things that are going wrong, like learning a little bit more about like the kind of metrics that are going on. I think kind of spending more time in there is what I'm really interested in learning more about.
Just muting myself and drinking coffee during that. That's wonderful. I think, yeah, it's like how you learn GraphQL, right? And then you're not ever done. So that's with programming or with anything. There's always new stuff coming out that you have to evolve and learn. So having strategies for dealing with that is great. How about you, Monica? Anything you're looking to pick up next?
I really want to dive into creating a Gatsby source plugin. So in Gatsby, a source plugin is how you can pull data into your Gatsby site from a third party. So I've definitely taken advantage of writing more like local ways of like sourcing data and also using other people's source plugins. But I'm really interested in figuring out if there's like something that can contribute back to the Gatsby ecosystem that would involve like writing GraphQL and allowing other people to consume that data using what I created. So that's something I'm interested in exploring soon.
That's awesome. That's really cool. Yeah, I think there's so many cool directions you can go in with that stuff, but Gatsby and GraphQL is obviously so interesting. And if you're looking for resources on that, Monica writes awesome blogs about that stuff. So you should definitely check it out. So we've kind of touched on this a little bit throughout, but are there, if you could go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice about GraphQL, if you could sit down with yourself where you're like pulling your hair out, trying to do something with GraphQL. I didn't rearrange that well. What would you say? What advice would you give? I'll start with you, Monica.
What advice would I give myself? That's a good question. I mean, I think probably just like really making sure that I understand the documents as opposed to like trying to apply what I know from other languages to GraphQL, because there are definitely a lot of things like syntax specific to GraphQL. So I would say like leaning on some documentation and making sure that I like thoroughly understand before like diving in, because I feel like there's like a certain amount of depth you can get into without like really understanding GraphQL, and then it can get really hairy. So I think that would be my recommendation: read the docs.
Yeah, nice. How about you, Kate?
So for me, I think it might be kind of slightly opposite of that, just because I personally learn best from kind of hands-on experience and practice. So for me, it would be probably like an advice to take breaks, make sure you're staying hydrated, make sure you don't get yourself too overwhelmed with amount of resources and knowledge out there, and people who are like experts already in the field, and you're just like starting out to learn GraphQL and you're not familiar with it. Like there are people, especially sometimes on Twitter, who will be happy to help and happy to offer their expertise and kind of like their training and their knowledge on GraphQL if you ask about it. But yeah, take breaks, make sure you're taking small steps every single day towards improvement. So maybe like read one article a day, but also make sure that you are somehow taking all of that knowledge that you gather and put it into practice, like into either one person project that like I've been doing. I've been actually building sort of an e-commerce art store on the side and building an API with that with GraphQL and like Node and TypeScript. And I've been essentially taking all of that server-side knowledge that I've took and put it into a single project. But I know that other people prefer kind of to separate it into like various projects.
Yeah, totally. That sounds like great advice for learning anything. I feel like is just working a little bit at it every single day. I sometimes feel like I want to learn something and then I take a whole day to learn something. And then I'm like, I can't commit that much time to that ever again. That's one day. I'm never going to go back to it. So yeah, just moving the ball forward a little bit every day is an awesome tip. I'm going to try to get a little like video of that later, Kate, so I can play it for myself every day and remember that stuff. How about you, Prince? What advice would you give yourself or to other people learning GraphQL?
I definitely think with both of the pieces of advice is like, getting that terminology or all of the things down is really key, I think, just to understanding the building blocks. And I'm a person like visually needs to see like, how does everything connect together? So like, what does the term mean when I see it in like code? I think it's easy to say something and be like, this clearly is a resolver, of course. Like, but like that doesn't necessarily make sense. And when you see it in a different context, how do you like apply that piece of knowledge? So that's why I like the blend of taking like the documents that we're learning and then also putting it into practice and getting that feedback about like, what would you do in this scenario? Because I think that's where sometimes I trip myself is I will like learn something. I'll be like, let me just apply it broad stroke, as opposed to recognizing how does it solve this particular problem and are there alternative solutions? One of the things about like the docs that I found really fascinating was pagination and like how GraphQL kind of like allows us to think about pagination slightly differently. And I was like, how do you know which one to choose? And getting tenant to explore that is really important.
Totally. That's great. How about you, Carolyn? What advice would you give? Yeah.
Yeah. So one is that GraphQL is not a programming language to make charts. It's not the same as D3. I wish someone would have told me that. Like, would have saved me a lot of sadness and stress. So I'm just going to like put that one into the universe. And then the second one, at the risk of sounding like I'm obsessed with you, Eve, I learned from you, which is to learn the query language and the schema definition language before diving into tools. Like learning those fundamentals, because sometimes when you're working with tools, at least I found that it can be difficult to separate those core GraphQL concepts from the nuances or intricacies of that specific tool. So yeah, that would be mine.
Yeah, totally. Well, thank you for the shout out. But yeah, I agree with myself that you should learn the query language and the schema definition language first if you can, because I think that brings a lot of people into GraphQL who might feel like it's not for them or it's not, they might not be developers and they want to, but there's still tons of people who need to get data, right? And GraphQL gives us this really nice, repeatable way of handling that. So that is me grinding my axe about fundamentals. So I will stop talking and I will ask another question. Are there any GraphQL projects that you're working on right now that you can talk about? Not secret projects, public fun projects that you would like to share?
So I'm trying to learn Python right now. So I'm building next a Sanrio API. So that's like, the company behind Hello Kitty and Friends. So I'm trying to figure out how to build GraphQL APIs with Python. I've been trying to figure out the Graphene Python library, but I'm also open to other ones. So if anyone out there is like proficient in Python and GraphQL and has tips, I would love to hear it. Selfish.
Not selfish at all. That's what the community is for having people do your work for you. Anybody else? Kate, are you working on any GraphQL things?
Oh yeah, like I mentioned, I'm currently working on kind of like an e-commerce API for an ad store that I think can be helpful for the community in like multiple ways. First of all, it can provide that API for people who are just learning to how to front end, who are just learning how to build like beautiful interfaces. And on the other hand, it can also provide sort of a reference of how to use GraphQL CodeGen and TypeScript and like just GraphQL as a whole, and just use it as a reference point for either adopting it in production or for other personal projects. And I hope that when I'm going to be kind of closer to publishing it, right now I haven't really connected a database to it, although the rest of the structure is ready. I just haven't exactly particularly had time with job searching and such to dive deeper into how like the best practices of connecting databases there. I know it's database agnostic, but I'm still sure there's like a ton of information out there on like the best way of doing it. So I just hope that when I'm going to publish it, somebody with more experience in GraphQL, if they see it, then they wouldn't necessarily judge me for the way that I wrote code, and instead would use it as a way to like provide mentorship and like perhaps like do a pull request with like certain improvements, whether it's like faster like response time or something like that, because I do believe that it's okay to make mistakes and it's okay to learn. And I think that bringing other people up and sharing your knowledge with other people is kind of the best way to go.
Totally. That's great. And yeah, anyone who's listening right now, Kate, you have to help Kate out with that. So mentors need to step up and help her out with that project because it sounds awesome. Monica, we picked on you a little bit earlier about Gatsby stuff. I don't want to put you on the spot for more projects because that's already a lot. Is that mainly where your focus is, or?
Yeah, so I would say creating a Gatsby source plugin is definitely something that I wanted to pick up soon. I had recently made a website of my favorite website. So it has like screenshots of all these different websites that I like just kind of bookmark for inspiration. So I wrote that with Next, and it has a GraphQL API. It's not like super sophisticated in GraphQL, so I kind of want to like revisit it and see like other ways that I can either improve on it or make it more dynamic, so that I could like upload the like site information, like upload the URLs like within the application. So that's kind of like one of the side projects that I want to revisit at some point soon.
That's amazing. Nice. You're always up to such cool stuff. Definitely. Everyone on this panel is an amazing engineer, an amazing teacher, and you should stop everything you're doing and go follow everything they're doing online. Follow them all on Twitter. Make sure that you are reading their blogs because they're putting so much heart into everything they're working on. And yeah, it's so cool. So I am super honored that I got to be here today. Thanks to everyone on the panel, Prince, Kate, Monica, Carolyn. Thank you for spending time with me today. I love all of you. And hope everyone enjoys the rest of the time at GraphQL Summit. There are awesome talks coming up, so stay tuned for much, much more. Thank you so much. And I'm going to do the goodbye wave on Zoom, even though you're not supposed to. Bye.